Before I start the video, as a quick reminder, check out my links down below to help support the channel. I am now in partnership with Baron of Dice. They have some awesome TCG accessories like playmats, deck boxes, and dice. And if you want to level up your setup, it is the perfect way to do so. And if you want to support the channel directly and get some sweet perks, consider joining the Patreon. If you want to get early access to videos or even some deck help, Patreon is where it's at. And so without further ado, let's get back into the video. Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome to Jurassic Magic. I am your host Devin here on this channel, and in today's video we're going to be discussing a very exciting and very explosive commander with Ozai the Phoenix King. This is coming out of the new Avatar Last Airbender set, which I am actually decently excited for. I've watched the show 2 or 3 times at the most. I'm trying to remember the last time I watched it. It was a couple years ago. Either way, this is a very exciting commander. Again, very explosive and very powerful. So let's read what it does. Ozai the Phoenix King for 2 double black and double red. It's a legendary creature, human noble. It has trample, firebending 4, and haste. If you lose unspent mana, that mana becomes red instead. And Ozai has flying and indestructible as long as you have 6 or more unspent mana. And he has a 7/7 body with some amazing flavor text. So just to give you my overall thoughts about this commander, I think it is pretty pushed. I think the fact that it gets trample, firebending 4, haste, and potentially indestructible and flying, all those keywords all in one body, is pretty strong. Of course, this is based off of him getting extra power off of Sozin's Comment, which by the way is also in here too. So if you're new to this channel and you haven't seen some of my videos, I am going to be breaking down Ozai the Phoenix King and building around him. I'm going to first discuss the staples of the deck. I'm also going to focus on a lot of the different things that synergize with Ozai and then discuss some win cons. And so without further ado, let's get it started and build around Ozai. Alright, so first things first, in order to achieve a successful deck, you need to have the right type of staples to further your game plan. I like to break these down into a couple of different categories. First, I like to talk about the ramp package, followed by card draw, and along with interaction. And interaction could come in many different forms, whether you're removing a creature on the battlefield or you're help protecting one of your own. Either way, these 3 core staples will help you achieve success in your deck. First of all, ramp. It comes in many different forms, whether you're talking about rituals, treasures, or mana artifact ramp. Of course, we're not in green, so we don't have abilities to search for our library and put lands onto the battlefield. In the color combination of red and black, we have access to a ton of rituals like Dark Ritual, Cabal Ritual, or even like Desperate Ritual. Of course, the best one of them all is Mana Geyser. I think this one's going to be very explosive in this deck, mainly because we get to keep it with Ozai, and I think that's a very neat interaction point I did want to discuss. Let's just say hypothetically, Ozai only has like 4 unspent mana in the air, and you have a Dark Ritual in your hand. Someone decides, okay, I'm going to try to destroy that guy before you have any more unspent mana. You could then just cast Dark Ritual and he will gain that indestructible and flying, so that way that removal kind of fizzles, which honestly makes Ozai a very fun and interesting commander. Besides that point, of course, rituals are going to be very powerful, but having mana to spend is also going to be equally as powerful. You could just float it in the air. Of course, mana rocks kind of come in any shape or form. There's like the talismans, there's also the signets. Really, any one of them will do just fine. But I feel like the best option would be treasures. I think treasures are going to help us a ton. As far as ramp goes, you have a ton of treasure support, especially in red. You could go small with like Ragavan, dealing a combat damage at the beginning of the game, getting a treasure token, and stealing a card from your opponent's library. Another fun option would be Descent into Avernus. This gives everybody treasure, so that's one big downside, but of course it's going to be dealing a ton of damage during the game. And if we have some sort of way of giving lifelink to Ozai, it might be a benefit to us. I also like Black Market Connections because all at the expense of life, you can get card draw, you can get treasure, and you can get a body on the battlefield. Most likely you're going to get the card draw and treasure every time. I also like cards like Grim Hireling or even Professional Facebreaker. On combat damage, you're going to get treasures. I like Grim Hireling a little bit more because you're going to get 2 treasures off of that, off of a swing at somebody, and it can act as removal too. But if you want to get extreme amount of mana while Ozai is on the battlefield, you could use Black Market along with Braid of Fire. Black Market has that ability whenever a creature dies, you put a charge counter on it, and then at your pre-combat main phase, you're adding a black mana for each charge counter on it. And Braid of Fire is a little similar, though a little cheaper, only at 2 mana. It has a cumulative upkeep of adding a red mana to your mana pool. Of course, you're going to be losing that mana unless you have Ozai on the battlefield, but again, that is extremely pushed, especially getting so much mana in the air the longer the game goes on. So now that I've talked about getting mana on the battlefield, I wanted to shift my focus and getting card draw. There's a lot of ways we can get card draw. One of my personal favorites is Blood for the Blood God. This is a great instant speed spell. This will costs 1 less for each creature that died this turn, but we're not really going to worry about that because we're going to have a ton of mana anyways. If we have Ozai on the battlefield, when we cast a spell, we're going to draw 8 cards, then we're going to be dealing 8 damage to each opponent. This is pretty insane, all at an instant speed spell. This is definitely more of a high risk, high reward kind of card for sure. Another card I like is Gix, the Yawgmoth Praetor, mainly because on combat damage, you are going to get a card draw. Of course, the more creatures we have, the more we're going to be using this ability. This also works politically. Your opponents could be swinging at each other instead of yourself, so that way they can get the card draw and losing life in the process. Not only that, this has a pretty insane activated ability of stealing opponents' decks, especially with the more cards you have in your hand. Another card draw option I like in this deck, because we're probably going to be dealing a ton of damage with Ozai because he is a 7/7 after all, is Nullspine Dragon. I like this one a lot because when it comes into play, you may discard your hand and draw cards equal to the damage dealt this turn. Even 7 is still pretty strong, even though it is 7 mana. Getting to refill your hand for that much mana is going to be huge. Alright, so now that I've talked about ramp and card draw, I wanted to move my focus onto interaction, and this kind of comes in many different forms, whether we want to remove a threat on the battlefield or trying to protect our own creatures. I'm first going to focus on that, protecting our own creatures. I love redirect spells, and red has a ton of them. You have cards like Redirect Lightning, Deflecting Swat, or even Untimely Malfunction. Each of these are going to be pretty significant. If somebody tries to Swords of Plowshare your commander, instead you can just redirect that spell and target another person's commander, maybe that one that's targeting you. But personally, one underrated one in my opinion is Return the Favor. I love this for the spree activations. It counts as a reverberate or copying a spell or redirecting a spell, or really anything you really want. And of course you could use both of those activations. I like this because if you want to copy a target triggered ability like your commander's ability, instead of getting 4 mana, you are going to get 8 mana, which is pretty insane. Of course, there's a lot of other things that you copy, but you kind of get the point. But of course, there is also a lot of interaction pieces that you could put in this deck as far as removal goes. You have like Deadly Rollick. You also have cards that remove enchantments like Withering Torment or Feed the Swarm. Black has an endless supply as far as removing creatures on the battlefield. That does include board wipes like Toxic Deluge or even Damnation. So of course, there's a ton of options. I'm not going to discuss every individual card draw, ramp, or interaction piece in this deck, at least in this video specifically. I do have a deck list down below in the description if you do want to go check it out. So now that I've talked about the staples, I wanted to shift my focus onto talking about interacting with our commander and how we could abuse his ability. Alright, so there's a lot of reasons why I like Ozai. There's a lot of synergy that you could take advantage of, especially with extra combats. I feel like every commander nowadays has like a combat trigger, and you want to get as much combats as you can to get more mana, especially with Ozai. So there's a lot of great ones that you could use, like Seize the Day, Relentless Assault, or even Savage Beating. Each of these could help ensure that you have ways of constantly getting more and more mana each time you swing. But I would say my favorite one out of these is definitely Savage Beating because of that Entwine ability. You could get an extra combat, as well as giving creatures you control double strike. That is going to really close out the game pretty fast, especially with Sozin. You swing in, he's going to have double strike. It's going to be 14 power swinging at somebody, and then with the extra combat, it's going to be another 14 maybe at that same person, taking him out of the game because of commander lethal, or swinging at a different person. Either way, you're getting a ton of mana in the air, but really not at the same time because of course you're paying into those costs. That's why I would prefer some options that have consistent ways of getting you extra combats like Karlach. I like this one a lot because it gives your creatures first strike and gets an additional combat phase basically every single turn that you're playing. Another one I personally like is Port Razor, potentially getting you 2 additional combats because when you hit somebody, you get to untap all your creatures, hit somebody again with it, as long as it's a different player, and then get into that additional combat and then swing again at somebody else. This is a very good card, clean, simple, and effective. Of course, the one downside is the fact that it doesn't really have any sort of evasion. So if somebody has a blocker, most likely they're going to be blocking it, so definitely try to stack some evasion on it for sure. But I would say the best option would easily be Aggravated Assault. This could potentially go infinite if you have another way of getting another mana to your mana pool rather than just having 4 with your commander. So if you have like one of those professional face breakers that get a treasure token on the battlefield on swinging combat damage, or even if you have like Neheb the Eternal, there are some ways that you can get additional mana when you swing in outside of just your commander. This is probably just going to help you close out the game pretty easily and pretty effectively too. Of course, I also want wanted to add in some more flavorful options from the Avatar Last Airbender set, like Sozin's Comet. This is basically a big story arc at the end of the series with Ozai and the Avatar fighting against each other. This is definitely going to give him a power-up, which obviously on Flavor Point does. The Sozin's Comet for 3 and double red. Each creature you control gains firebending 5 until end of turn, so you're adding 5 red mana to your mana pool when each creature is attacking, which is going to be huge. The more creatures you have on the battlefield, the more mana you're going to be putting in the air. So I love this for a flavor standpoint. This is obviously going to gel well with the deck, getting more mana in the air for ourselves. Another card I like from the set is Avatar Roku Firebender. This is pretty incredible for this type of deck, especially when we want to store a lot of mana, even though it is 6 mana. But again, if we have a lot of mana floating in the air with our commander, it's going to be easy to cast. This has the ability whenever a player attacks, add 6 red mana. Until end of combat, you don't lose this mana at step's end. So this kind of means in a way, whenever a player is going to be attacking on their turns or our own turn, we're going to be adding 6 red mana. This is going to be very good and very strong because we're just going to be keeping that mana floating in the air with our commander and storing a bunch of it over time. Also, he does have an activated ability. If we want to OKO somebody, we just pay 3 red mana. Target creature gets +3/+0 until end of turn. This will mean if we have enough mana, we could potentially get commander lethal with our commander activating that ability so many times. So this is obviously a very flavorful fit that I wanted to highlight. Of course, this is going to be a Firelord Ozai deck, so you got to include the other version of him with, well, Firelord Ozai. This works as a mana outlet. You pay 6 mana, exile the top card of each opponent's library. Until on a turn, you may pay one of those cards without paying their mana cost. I like this. I don't really care about the other ability, even though it can be useful when you swing in with him. You can sacrifice a creature, gain red mana equal to the creature's power, so that can be useful in some situations if we want an extra burst of mana. But of course, I like that activated ability a little bit more. If we have a ton of it lying around, we could just constantly steal people's spells. So those are some of the cards that synergize with our commander. Now I wanted to shift my focus and talk about some win cons. So there are a lot of ways you could win the game. Obviously, you could use X spells like Torment of Hailfire or even Extinguinate because you're adding a bunch of mana each time you attack with your commander, or other means. Obviously, that's one way to win, and that's a little boring, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, you could add some of those just to make sure you have that X factor, quite literally. But to me personally, I would much rather go into the full theme of swinging in with him for commander lethal damage. He does have 7 power and 7 toughness. 3 swings away means commander lethal damage for one opponent getting knocked out. Of course, you could amplify the damage even further by giving him double strike. Something like Embercleave is a perfect example that you could catch somebody off by surprise. When you swing in with him, you get that mana floating in the air, then you attach Embercleave right away, dealing 16 damage because he does get +1/+1. I also like the idea of doubling damage too. You have Gratuitous Violence or even Twin Flame Tyrant. That'll help him deal 14 damage, but of course you could amplify that a little bit more. Why stop there when you could triple the damage with something like Fire Emancipation or City on Fire? Each of these are pretty powerful in their own right. Of course, tripling damage is going to help close out the game pretty fast. However, damage doublers and damage triplers are pretty good. I also like the idea of using an avatar card like Fated Firepower. This does have flash, so then when you swing in with your commander, you'll get that mana and then you could just pump that into Fated Firepower, and this will enter with X fire counters. So let's just say hypothetically pump 14 counters into this, which is probably going to be easier said than done. If a source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus an amount of damage equal to the number of fire counters on this enchantment instead. So if you swing in with your commander, instead of dealing 14 damage, you're going to be dealing a total of 21 damage, catching somebody off guard. So those are some ways you could win. Of course, there's a lot of other ways you could win in this deck. The sky is basically the limit with this commander. I think it's super powerful. But now that will do it from you guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this video on this new commander, Ozai, the Phoenix King. This is extremely strong and probably a little bit too much push. Obviously, nowadays they're starting to push more and more commanders to be quite powerful. I'm kind of on the fence on if I like it or not. I like powerful commanders, but at the same time, I don't like how some of my other commanders are probably getting depowered based off these other new commanders. But at the end, this is a very exciting commander. I'd like to hear your thoughts down below and how you would build him too. Also, if you can, on your way out, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.